Hello and welcome to the Analysys Mason podcast. My name's Tom Rebeck and I'm a partner in our research division. I'm here with Ian Adkins, who is a principal in our consulting division. Ian recently wrote an article on the role of telecoms in reducing emissions, and we'll put a link to this piece in the show notes. So let's start off with the UK government. It set a target for net zero emissions by 2050. So firstly, Ian, what could the role of telecoms be in meeting this target?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. The utility requirements for telecoms are quite demanding, and the backdrop really is that utilities are looking to put more and more communications, connectivity deeper and deeper into their networks. So in the case of the net zero targets, you can imagine there's more and more renewable energy. It's going to be deployed across the country to connect into the electricity network anywhere really. What this means is that for the telecoms networks that already currently support those sort of utility networks, they're going to have a massive increase in volume of locations that need connectivity. I think I mentioned in the article up to hundreds of thousands. Actually, there's some uncertainty. It could be millions of devices that need connectivity. And again, referring to electricity, they have a range of smart grid applications that they're developing for the energy industry. They're still nascent, but it's generally thought that they need to be very reliable. Some of them might need particularly low latency. You can imagine what sort of challenges this imposes on telecoms networks. So, in essence, it's unlikely to be something you can buy off the shelf. So, hence. The role of telecoms is going to be absolutely paramount when it comes to these sort of what seem a long way from telecoms, net zero emissions, but it is actually a really major dependency.
Okay, so it's kind of a gradual intertwining of the telecoms network with the utilities networks.
Yes, and that, if like, because of that volume increase and the nature of, I mentioned smart grid applications, we're working on a project which has just in what's been presented to us as a team, 10 or 12 different types of applications, and we're going to be developing, looking to see how those aggregate into telecoms type of solutions. And you can hear from what I'm saying that it's still early days. And I think when you then scale that up from just one company into multiple companies who are geographically in different locations, you can imagine how to then go and say to the telecoms operators, or even actually self-provision a private network, what do they need to do? And I suppose I'm not sure, having been in the industry, or both industries, for a while, I'm not sure anybody fully grasps the extent of change this is going to have on both industries.
Right. Let's go into that in a bit more detail.
Yeah.
You touched on the challenges before. So what are the challenges for telecoms networks?
Well, firstly, is the coverage challenge. So I mentioned potentially millions of devices, and when you think of coverage, you say, okay, well, you just expand coverage. Particularly when you think of wireless, you can cover it. You can cover wide areas. Yes, you can. But when you think of that, operators they tend to serve populated areas, and I've just mentioned that the utility networks they're normally quite in sometimes quite extreme locations, extremely remote, and actually where you put renewable energy isn't necessarily in populated areas. You need to, it's often served from sometimes long distances. And even at a local level, it's clearly, utility networks go across the fields. They don't just sit around the villages. Yeah. So this sort of coverage challenge is the first thing. It's a quite different solution than using mobile network operator as the example. They are very focused on populated areas. That's where their commercial return is coming from. So that's one point. Secondly, utilities are actually just one of many customers for a telecoms operator, and when you put them alongside different industries, they're not overly influential when it comes to their scale. And actually, because of what I was saying about the different sorts of requirements, they actually have complex requirements. They are more difficult to satisfy. So as a telecoms operator, they might tend towards the easier customer
Yeah.
customers to serve, of course. So the utilities, they won't get the attention. From their perspective, they may not have such a competitive environment or less choice. And you can see that you've got, I think I've used the phrase tension in this article, which is clearly there from just two different industries that have really quite different drivers. But certainly the utilities need telecoms to be more aligned.
So I guess one way of, and you talked about it before, was private networks. That could be one way of utilities getting a network that meets their requirements, and you don't have that necessarily the tension between the telecoms operators who are designed to serve a mass market and utilities which are a relatively small part of that and have very unique requirements. So what role could private networks play, particularly I guess 5G private networks?
Yeah. Well, I think it's certainly seen by the utilities industry as it's got tremendous potential. It's perhaps something they've wanted for a long time. Generally, the utilities industries don't think commercial operators, i.e. the telecoms operators, can meet their requirements. They can't necessarily trust them sufficiently. And when I mention these tensions, you can see perhaps why. So they would favour private networks. And when you talk about that from a wide area coverage perspective and focus again on mobile, then it would be an ideal position to get some dedicated spectrum, and certainly this has happened in certain countries. When we think about this from a UK perspective, that hasn't happened yet, and I know that within the UK, Ofcom is looking into this, but and to be fair to them, they certainly have to balance competing requirements, in terms of their role in terms of thinking about what's best for spectrum and how to be
and when
efficient.
you're talking about private networks, what sort of private networks? Because typically we think of private networks as being fairly small, just over for a factory or a port or whatever, but utilities, they need wide area coverage.
Absolutely, and that's the major difference with perhaps where private networks are developing a lot of interest. They tend to be smaller in scale, in just the size of the network, and because it is focusing perhaps if you like on the campus type size and factories, whereas we're talking here about national coverage. Now depending on the utility structure, that can mean one company or it could mean many companies. And actually when you then look at the different sectors within utilities, so electricity, water, gas, what tends to happen, you certainly don't have a contiguous situation. So the challenge for the private network, first of all, is who would run it? Who's going to come and invest in it? So it's not clear, depending on, I suppose there are country differences here, but a question to ask is who would take the risk and invest? And the article I mentioned is focused on the UK. It was part of a wider campaign, and certainly in the UK, it's certainly unclear who might step forward. Other countries have gone forward with sort of consortium of different companies because they're all interested. They've created a consortium jointly, or in other countries, one of the utilities has taken a lead. It tends to be easier if they already operate at a national scale anyway, and then they can obviously probably actually allow others onto the network or others to utilize the infrastructure. But it could be years before those sort of, going back to the dedicated spectrum, it could take years to make that decision. And here we are talking about, we've got to start the net zero type target now. It's a challenge,
Makes sense. Also in the piece, and kind of comes back to this tension, how do you resolve those tensions? In the piece, you say you need better alignment between the utilities and telecom sectors. So how do you achieve that alignment? What does the government need to do to help that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, certainly government, I think, has a role. And to be fair to the utilities, I think they are very well sort of coordinated to some extent on what they need, but don't necessarily have all the answers. And I think the government role is probably timely in the sense that I suppose from an education, and this isn't meant to be a detriment to sort of people understanding each other's sort of position but in terms of the detail of understanding that position, understanding each other's industries, their drivers, what sort of market challenges there are, some of the points I'm raising. I think the departments that look after utilities, and I don't think it necessarily is one, need to understand the way telecoms works, to telecoms markets work, the way the regulation works, and vice versa. You need some sort of common understanding. And I think ideally you'd have some sort of coordination to develop like a joint departmental policy around telecoms solutions that can serve utilities needs. And so what that is trying to enable is going back to sort of the point about risk and investment, is it helps try and set the environment where that sort of investment and the attraction for innovative solutions can be stimulated. We know in telecoms, because of private networks, as just one example, and just the way technology is changing, there are a number of new innovative service providers and different business models are starting to evolve. They could actually present some of the opportunities back to serve utilities, and that in turn can, that pressure would also attract the operators to focus on utilities. So whoever would come forward, I think that all would help. That sort of joint policy type idea is you're trying to remove those tensions I've been mentioning, and therefore, from a commercial perspective, you're aiming for this virtuous circle. At the moment, whichever direction you start from, you hit barriers. The utilities don't trust. Perhaps trust is the wrong word, but don't necessarily believe that operators commercially can provide a sufficiently reliable or a service that can be backed up by power for 48 hours or days.
To really meet their needs.
Yeah.
Okay, so kind of better communication between the sectors and better coordination at a government level.
Yeah, and to the extent that it starts to be set out in policies, policies and then potentially regulation. And if you look at both sectors' regulation, they probably don't set up the ability for the industries that, the operators, whether it's a utility or a telecoms operator, to serve each other. They are already set up, not necessarily to fully fail, but not to make it. It's not going to be as easy as it perhaps could be.
Yeah. Okay, makes sense. Great, thank you very much, Ian. As I said, we'll put a link to Ian's article at the bottom in the show notes. At the bottom of that piece, we've got Ian's contact details. So if you'd like to discuss any of the issues raised in this podcast with him, please feel free to contact him directly. To automatically receive all future episodes of the Analysys Mason podcast, please subscribe to our feed. Thank you for listening.